Hey, Brambro back with some more Grand Tactician Civil War. Starting a new campaign, and this is going to be a Union campaign. Before getting into that per se, however, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the thumbnail photo that I chose for this series. Because the more I looked at it, the more kind of interesting things I found, and I just thought I'd share a little bit of that. And why I chose this photo for the thumbnail. The first reason, kind of prosaic, is I'm not too familiar with like copyright things that can get into trouble when posting videos, which, oh, by the way, is also the reason why I'm recording, post these videos without the game music, because I've run into problems with that before with other games. But you're just kind of hunting around the internet for images, and there's hundreds of thousands really, but so many of them not really sure if they're I might run into copyright issues with them in a video, so I kind of leave it for stuff that is clearly open source or not, or like Library of Congress type stuff. I see so many really cool paintings and colorized photos, and I think, wow, that'd make a really good thumbnail. But then YouTube might say, can't use that. So that kind of left me with some of the more standard black and white stuff. It's similar to what I used for the thumbnail for the previous Confederate campaign. So that's one reason why I went with, one of the older black and white photos that might not pop quite as much visually. The second reason that I was kind of drawn to this photo, though, is right here in this shot is four pretty solid Union generals all together. And, these are all, it's just a good group of generals. And what this is the senior leadership of the Union 2nd Corps in the Army of the Potomac during the 1864 time frame. This photo, I think, was probably taken during the Overland Campaign, or right around in that time frame. The Corps commander sitting here in front is Winfield Scott Hancock, who was, and I think is today, by historians, considered one of the best, if not the best, Corps commander, probably one of the best Corps commanders in the Union Army, and probably the best Corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. And, there's always quibbling and discussion about those types of things, but at the very least, Ulysses S. Grant considered him the best Corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. And that's a fairly, I think that's an opinion in whom we can place some trust. He was called Hancock the Superb. Apparently cut a rather dashing figure, kind of looked the part. In this picture, he looks a little portly, and in many other photographs from the time, he doesn't. So that kind of stuck out at me a little bit. Hancock had been badly wounded at Gettysburg, and it had taken him a long time to recover. So by this time, this is about a year later, not quite a year later, maybe May, June timeframe, perhaps. I don't know exactly when this photograph was taken. So he had recovered enough to return to the Army and resume command and all that sort of thing. But we're seeing him at a time now where he has not done a lot of physical activity for almost a year while recovering from that wound. which is still troubling him at this point, even though he's back in command. So that may have something to do with that. Anyway, standing behind him are his 3 infantry division commanders. Francis Barlow on the left, David Birney in the middle, and John Gibbon on the right. And one thing that kind of stood out to me was that right here in this photo, little microcosm of kind of the 3 different types of general in this conflict on both sides. Hancock, of course, is the Corps commander. He was a West Point graduate, as the vast majority of generals on both sides at his level were. Among the 3 division commanders, John Gibbon was a West Point graduate. He was serving in the Army at the time that this war started, at a much, much lower rank. He was probably a captain or something like that. David Birney was an example of what would be called a political general. You know, just the fact he was in the Army at all, not necessarily due to political influence, but the rank that he attained. Probably politics had some or even a lot to do with that. And then Barlow was just a straight up volunteer officer. And so we have a West Pointer, a political general, and a volunteer right here in the senior levels of command in the Second Corps. I thought that was interesting. John Gibbon, probably best known for early in the war, having commanded the Iron Brigade, which itself was one of the best known units in the Army of the Potomac. The Iron Brigade stood out for several reasons. The first being where its troops came from. Army of the Potomac was the Eastern Army, and just, you know, kind of makes sense as regiments were formed up into larger corps and armies. The regiments came from states. They were not directly raised by the federal government per se. They were raised by state governments. And so it makes sense that you'd have a lot of New England regiments and New York regiments and Pennsylvania regiments in the Army of the Potomac over the east, whereas the Western Army, the armies of like Ohio and the Tennessee and the Cumberland, they had a lot more troops from those states further west. And so the Iron Brigade and the Army of the Potomac kind of stood out because it was composed solely of Western regiments, or what would have been considered Western at that time. If memory serves, maybe I should have looked at this before I started jabbering, but I think all the regiments in the Iron Brigade were from Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Nobody from basically east of the Appalachian mountain chain. So they stood out for that reason. Another reason the Iron Brigade kind of stood out was the distinctive headgear. They had these, you know, not that little cap that is kind of the most typically thought of Civil War soldier headgear. They had these big black hats with a proper brim all the way around. Kind of, probably not identical, but something similar to what Hancock is wearing here. And so they kind of stood out in an entire brigade of guys wearing those hats, and they were the only brigade that had them like that. And, you know, the two armies, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and the Federal Army of the Potomac, you know, they kept butting heads over time at various battles, the big battles, you know, like Antietam and Gettysburg and the Peninsula Campaign, Fredericksburg. They got pretty familiar with each other, and they kind of knew who was who on the other side, or at least had a pretty good idea. And at Gettysburg, when that battle first started occurring, it was a meeting engagement. Union cavalry and a part of Hill's Third Corps on the Confederate side kind of ran into each other at Gettysburg. Nobody was really seeking to fight there. And initially, neither side really had a firm idea of what they were getting into. On the Confederate side, there was a thought that they were up against some detached cavalry, maybe some militia. And on the Union side, they knew that there was Confederate infantry over there, but didn't really know how much. But the first infantry corps that was engaged, that came up first to support Buford's cavalry, was the First Corps under the command of General John Reynolds, who was killed that day in the action. But when the Iron Brigade, which was part of that corps, went into action, the Confederate soldiers on the other side recognized them. And that was the first inkling that any of the Confederates had that they were up against the Army of the Potomac, not just local militia or detached cavalry. Because they saw those big black hats and go, oh, we're up against the Army of the Potomac, guys. And they knew that where there was one Army of the Potomac Corps, the others couldn't be too far away. And they were in for something a little bit more than a local skirmish that that wouldn't be remembered today except among the real Civil War buffs and historians. So that's given, and by this time the Iron Brigade, he has been promoted and he is in divisional command in a different corps. David Birney, political officer, per se, and what I've always found a little bit interesting about Birney is that there were a lot of these officers in both armies who reached their position through political influence rather than military background or performance. Predictably enough, as a group, as a class of general overall, pretty mixed results. And a lot of them were just plain not very good and should not have been in the positions that they were. Birney was not one of those. Pretty solid performance throughout the war. And I'm not that familiar with the details of all of his career history. And so maybe he didn't necessarily become a general solely through merit. But he seems to have done the job pretty competently and remained in those types of positions throughout, through his service in the war. And just pretty solid and a good general overall, not just, well, he's good for a political guy. He did not survive the war. He died not long after this picture would have been taken, but not from, he wasn't wounded or killed. He came down with, it's not entirely clear that it was properly diagnosed at the time, but he is thought to have died of typhoid fever. It's basically he got sick and left command because of that. Kind of went home to recover and didn't. And he died a few months later. And then Francis Barlow over here was the 3rd Division commander, and he was a volunteer, straight up. Had never had any military experience whatsoever. I don't think Birney had either. Birney and Barlow were both lawyers prior to the war, and brought no military background to their, no prior military either training, background, or combat experience. Not even as a volunteer during the Mexican War, which Barlow simply would not have been old enough to, in any case. But Barlow, however, just straight up volunteer. He as you can see in the picture, he was pretty young. He would have been about 29 or 30 as a divisional commander, a general. So he was already fairly young for that, and he looks even younger, which people commented on. He was described at one point by a staff officer as he looks like a mounted newsboy. But anyway, so I thought that was interesting, and just kind of now were any of these guys? Ooh, these were like the best generals on the Union side during the entire war. No, not really. But they were all pretty good. Hancock might have been kind of on the short list for that kind of description. But as a team, a corps commander with all three division commanders, kind of the average among the four, this was probably one of the strongest corps commander and subordinate division commander leadership teams of any corps, probably in the Union Army, and almost definitely so in the Army of the Potomac. So that was another reason I was kind of drawn to this photo. But those were considerations. What kind of put it over the edge, and what I really like about this photo, is I always get a kick out of Francis Barlow's checkered shirt. And that wasn't just kind of a thing that happened, for this photo. He wore this all the time. He was known for it. He probably took a little bit of ribbing for that from time to time. It was kind of his trademark. And I just always think it's funny whenever I see him wearing it. That's why I chose this photo. One other thing about Barlow. This straight sword that Gibbon is holding, this was the standard issue officer's sword in the Army. Or at least for infantry officers, it was. And we can see Barlow's having none of that. Look at this enormously long cavalry saber that he's got. I mean, it's longer than his leg. And he carried this not for combat reasons. You can kind of see from his shirt and his demeanor. I've never seen a picture of Barlow where he's like standing straight. He's always kind of slouching with a hip stuck out, leaning against something here. He's got this air of like, okay, this war may be serious, but I'm not taking this army bullshit seriously. I always get that vibe from Barlow. But one thing he was a stickler on was he hated straggling. To the point where when his division, or earlier his brigade, whenever they were on the march, he'd detach a company or something to march in the rear in line with fixed bayonets to prod the stragglers along and make them keep up. And he himself would, if he saw anybody straggling, he'd whip out this cavalry saber, which he probably didn't even sharpen, I would guess. Yeah, and he'd ride up behind him and whack him on the butt with him. That's why he carried this damn thing. Anyway, just some kind of interesting things I thought from this photo. And y'all, if y'all have watched my previous campaigns, y'all know sometimes I just go off on a tangent and talk about this kind of stuff. So with that, let's get into the campaign. Okay, so here we are on the campaign start screen. We're going to go with a summer 1861 start. And going back to the final episode of the CSA campaign, I remarked that I had not played this game on the hardest difficulties yet. I think in the last posted campaign before this one, I went with hard difficulty and mediocre aggressiveness. So I figured, well, I'm just going to go full tilt here, and we're going to go very hard difficulty and whatever the very high aggression. I have read some people write their opinion that aggressiveness on very high actually kind of hurts the AI a little bit, because sometimes they just run out there and make movements that they really shouldn't. Well, we'll see. And with very hard difficulty, it's going to give the Confederate the highest boost to starting national morale. It's going to give them more recruits. And one thing I'd kind of glossed over and didn't really recognize, it's going to give them better casualty ratios during battles. I hadn't really caught on that was one aspect of the difficulty level. They're going to gain experience better, recover morale better, and they're going to have higher fighting spirit. Fighting spirit. So basically, this is as hard as the game can make it on us with the AI. It doesn't get any harder than this. As far as these two settings, it would be even harder doing it as the CSA, but I wanted, which I'm going to do as well, but I wanted to do it on this level with both Union and CSA, and having just finished up a CSA, I'm going Union this time, and then I'll do Confederate after that. I've also got all of these realism options turned on. The order delays, the fog of war, the readiness system, which I've played with before, and in feuds as well. The kind of the last campaign I played with the CSA, I turned the feuds on, which was the first time I'd played with the feuds, and it really didn't cause that big of a problem, to be honest. I was a little bit kind of underwhelmed with the feuding thing. All right, policies. We'll go with random and see what the CSA picks, but so the kind of default starting policies for Union are industrialization, Indian Wars, and Kansas a free state. Well, I'm not doing those. I'm not doing all those. Let me deselect all these so that So industrialization, yeah, I'm going with that. This one's pretty important, and I like it for the CSA side too. You get bigger population, therefore indirectly you get more recruits. It does hit national morale a little bit by -5, and that's okay. And you need industrialization in order to go beyond industrialization to policies later in the campaign, which I want to do. So this is one. I like security measures, and I'm going to go with that as well. It reduces the amount of ships and weapons that the CSA starts with, and it also gives them a -5 morale nerf from the beginning. So I think this one is well worth taking. And I took both of these in the last Union campaign I did as well. But for the third one, I want to do something a little different. Underground Railroad is fairly attractive. It gives the CSA some economic hits, and because there's fewer slaves, that means there's more white folks that need to do labor back home, and therefore that results in reducing available recruits. So I think that one's pretty strong. Kansas Free State isn't all. It's a default historical one that the game will start you with on historic setting, but I think there's just better ones. Northern support in Kansas plus 25. It's good, but Kansas really doesn't have that high a population, and so there's not going to be that many troops in the army coming from Kansas in the first place. Plus 5 support in all free states. That is pretty good. I'm not at all saying that this is a worthless policy. However, I think there's better, and I have played with this one before, and I kind of want to pick one I never have before. Go West is pretty interesting. It way increases northern support in California and Oregon, which are states by this point, not territories. Increases their population size, and makes possible recruitment from those states. And it also increases trade on the land trails westward. This one's tempting, but plus 20% population of states, which it kind of goes back to the Kansas consideration. I don't really know how many men that really means. Like, more population and you can recruit, and if it's like a total of like 2,000 or something, maybe that's not that big a deal. Support abolitionism, discouraging secession, Southern support in all states within the Union minus 10. There's going to be very little Confederate support in most northern states anyway. And so this primarily pertains, I think, to Missouri and Kentucky. And if I thought that there was going to be a real push by the Confederacy to fight in Missouri and Kentucky to the point of trying to make those states secede, this would be pretty attractive. And with very hard difficulty and very high aggression, maybe they will, to a degree that I have not experienced before. So later in the campaign, I might be thinking, man, I wish I'd taken that policy. But I'm going to pass on this. Enforced neutrality. This is primarily about preventing European intervention. It directly decreases the chance of European intervention, and also indirectly further decreases that chance, because this will unlock going to the higher diplomacy policies. And it is very possible for the CSA in this game to get to European intervention. And as the player, and there's several posted CSA campaigns available on YouTube where the player has done that. But it does require pretty strong investment in the King Cotton and the diplomacy lines, and you only get so many policies. I don't think the AI is typically going to do that. And as far as the improved amount and type of weapons that one gets with diplomacy policies, I think we'll do just fine with just the first diplomacy policy plus the domestic production, which is kind of the whole idea of the industrialization policy in the first place. Breadbasket is kind of the same thing. It helps with European relations, and it unlocks the high ag policies, which also help European relations. I do like taking one or two of the breadbasket line in game, primarily for agricultural subsidies, so that I can keep my army fed. But similar to this other starting policy, I don't think we're going to be very reliant on level 3, level 4 ag policies to prevent European intervention. Passing on this. Indian Wars is pretty good in that it improves our Union national morale. Actually, that doesn't say Union national morale, it says Union morale. So that may actually count for Army morale. Maybe they're talking about Army morale, or maybe that means both Union national and Army morale. I don't know. And then it also improves military experience. However, it also improves it for the CSA as well. So the military experience part I kind of see as a wash. It's really about, do I want or need that morale boost? And I think I'm willing to pass on that. And then finally, there is Union Pacific Railroad. You start with the Union Pacific Railroad built, which increases trade from the West. That alone, that's not the big selling point, but we start with +2 in Union credit rating, so that's that much longer we get to go without going for those policies. And it increases our railroad transport capacity and construction speed by 25%. And that's significant. The industrialization policy line gives us increased transportation. This policy by itself does not, but the industrialization line that we intend to go down to probably level 3 increases transportation capacity. And we're doubling down on that with Union Pacific, which will further increase the size of forces that we can carry via rail, and the rail capacity has a direct effect on the effectiveness of one's supply network. So I see Union Pacific and industrialization is kind of reinforcing each other, and I think I'm going to go Union Pacific for this campaign. Right. Start. I think in quite a while ago, long before I had ever started recording and posting these things, I did play at least part of a Union campaign once with that Go West policy. And if I remember correctly, it's a little hazy. That was quite a while ago, and in an earlier version of the game too. There's been patches and everything since then. And I seem to think that there was actually a decent, nothing like the big states in the Union, like New York or Pennsylvania, but as I recall, there were a fair amount of recruits over in California and Oregon. Okay, here we are, July 1861. So Fort Sumter has happened, the war has started, Virginia has seceded. And there's forces on the map. And the one thing to look for is what policies, starting policies, did the Confederacy take? Okay, they did take Old Dominion, which is standard. They took industrialization, okay, and they took arms agents, which kind of counteracts what I did with security measures. A big piece of this was to start the Confederacy with less weapons, and arms agents just kind of counteracted that and increased it by 50%. And they can produce Springfields in their own production. So, okay, so we didn't get as much effect from this as we wanted, but by the same token, neither did they. These two kind of canceled each other out. And they got -5 national morale from our policy, and we got -5 national morale from theirs. Okay, but if they took Old Dominion, that means that Richmond, Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy, close to Washington. If they had not taken that policy in the randomization, then the Confederate capital would be down here at Montgomery, Alabama, which would be a lot farther away. And before we get off policies, we will start with, so we've got military 1, we have the first in industrialization already. I don't know if that's standard or if that ties into us having taken industrialization. So basically, and because the war started, we have this chapter 2 tier already available as well. And we start with industrialization, military 1, and the first 2 militia acts. So right now, if we recruit troops, I had a similar discussion on this for the last Union campaign. Right now, if we start recruiting troops, they are going to be 12-month troops, and we're going to lose a lot of them in the middle of the summer of 1862. Don't really want that. So I don't want to recruit a whole bunch of new troops yet, even if I had the manpower pool to do so, which we do. We have 120,000. But I want to get Militia Act 3 with 24-month enlistments first. That is the first order of business. And then I'm going to want to go for the 36-month. I won't wait for this Militia Act 4 to recruit the first troops, but I'm going to want this pretty soon as well, as we build out the military as the campaign continues. So this is priority 1. I want to get to the Army Corps structure and the increased subsidies for recruitment, civil order, and trade warfare pretty quickly. So military 2 is going to be an early policy I go for. And then finally, as the United States, and given the policies that we have taken for the start and intend to take as we go along, we're going to reach a point where we produce way more, at least infantry small arms, rifles, than we have troops to carry them. It's just the way it goes. But that is going to take a while to ramp up. And we're not really going to see that production really get going until the winter of 1861 at the earliest, and then really continuing into 1862. Meanwhile, we're going to have some fighting we need to do in 1861, so we need some rifles now. And you get a pretty nice little chunk of Enfield and Lorenz rifles from this Diplomacy 1 policy. I don't think I'm particularly interested with the later diplomacy policies. I don't think we're going to need them for the intervention piece. And there are some good weapons down through here. including some cannon. But I think we're going to be able to produce what we, by the time we would be taking these sorts of policies, by that time we should be making plenty of adequate weapons ourselves. So Diplomacy 1 is going to come early, but not the rest of this line. As we go along, periodically we'll need to keep an eye on our credit rating. So government funding 1 will definitely happen at some point fairly early. And then government funding 2 will come along later. I like to do at least 1 or maybe 2 of the breadbaskets just to increase ag subsidies and keep the provisions flowing. That's kind of my outlook on the policy tree. And really not that different for the way I played the Confederate campaign either. I really didn't go that far in diplomacy for that one either. I kind of had plans to go at least 1 or 2 steps more, but that campaign actually ended pretty early. There was stuff I had plans to do in that campaign that I never got around to. All right. But for now, Militia 3. Probably followed by Diplomacy 1, so we can get some rifles in their hands, and Military 2. So I can pretty quickly start establishing the kind of structure that I want. Right. Finances. We do not need any politics subsidies for now. Later, as we butt up against the limit of available policies, we'll start funding that. But there's no need to, and probably won't be a need to until 1862. Everything else, y'all have already seen it in previous campaigns. In the current state of the game, there's really no reason not to just max them out. There just isn't. The percentage of the even with everything on very high, the percentage of the budget that subsidies is going to suck up is pretty low. You spend way more just on administration. Even if there wasn't a war, it takes so much time, you got to run a government. So this is always going to be a much bigger number than subsidies. Interest costs on deficit spending will always be bigger. Of course, the Army upkeep is going to be way bigger. Even recruitment will be much, it's just not that big a part of the budget. So in the current state of the game, just peg them at very high and not worry about it again. The next update to this, the next major update to this game, which will be 1.06, and it's probably coming fairly soon, before the end of the year in any case, I would think, is supposed to focus primarily on the economic aspect. So if you're, for anyone who may be watching this quite a while in the future, after 1.06 has dropped, what I just said about, just peg them all very high and leave it, that might not be true at all. So, as of now, in April 2022, during 1.05, you can do this. As either side. You can do this as Confederacy as well. All right. Then make sure I got auto manage unticked. If you leave it ticked, then the AI will start screwing with all these and with your tax levels. Speaking of tax levels, I've always kept these completely pegged over as well. However, the tax income is a fairly kind of the same thing. The tax income really isn't that big of your funding. That's going to wind up being deficit spending. So unless there's like a huge credit rating drop and you get down close to the point where you can't recruit any more troops, I'm kind of thinking I might experiment with dropping them a little bit and see if, something like 25 instead of 30%, and see if there's a notable increase in trade and corporate activity and national wealth. We're starting with very poor wealth, and this is just kind of the general level of wealth among the population entirely. And we start very poor, and there's expansions and contractions, and these lines are going to wind up going up and down and up and down and up and down. But I'm kind of wondering if I just ease off a little bit on these tax rates, something about like this maybe. Maybe that will improve personal wealth and corporate wealth enough that it spurs more ironworks and factories. And even if the tax rate's a little bit lower, if it improves the wealth of the population, then maybe the overall amount of taxes that we get will stay about the same or even be a little bit higher. You know what? I'm gonna do that. I don't know if this is a good idea at all. Let's go 25% and 4% instead of 30 and 5. And just kind of see what happens. We'll see. Okay. Forces. And this is kind of standard. Summer 1861 start, you always kind of have the same structure. Our biggest army is the Army of Northeastern Virginia, sitting here at Washington, D.C. It's almost 33,000 men at the moment. But, as I talked about earlier, all these brigades are basically on 3-month contracts. And a whole bunch of these guys are going home within 24 days. First Brigade under Erasmus Keyes, they're going home. They're 2,500 men right now. A month from now, they will not be. They'll be about half that size. And that is pretty much the case for the overwhelming majority of maybe all of these forces that you start with. So you're kind of in this situation of use them now, right now. Otherwise, if you wait, you're just going to be sitting behind the river waiting for more recruits to show up. And that's kind of true across the board with all these armies. So there's big pressure here to do something with the forces at hand early. Because it's not a use it or lose it. It's a use it now because you will lose it kind of situation. And then we've got an army over here in western Maryland, right at the bottom of the Shenandoah Valley. About 18,000 men. McClellan has a force called the Army of Occupation in what is still western Virginia. And then there's some militia forces up here at Wheeling. There is nothing currently in the Tennessee, Kentucky area. This is like a big hole here in the middle of the overall theater. And then there's a small force, nope, that's a squadron. Over here in southwestern Missouri is a little over 5,000 men in the Army of the West. And I think people are probably fairly familiar with what the Confederacy probably has. They're not spotted, but there's a couple of different forces down here. The Missouri State Guard and their Western Army. And those two forces combined are significantly larger than this one. There's a little bitty command, just a couple of thousand men, like maybe 3,000, 4,000 at most, at Nashville, most likely, or in the Nashville area, which we have nothing to oppose that at the moment. There's a little bitty Confederate force somewhere down in this area. It's pretty small. Not really big enough to do much to McClellan's army on its own. But sometimes Confederate forces like to cross the mountains after McClellan. And then we have these two visible armies. 25, well, currently 10,000 men. On this tooltip, the first number is the number of troops dedicated to this army, maybe still getting recruited or not yet arrived yet. So intelligence tells us that there are 10,000 men here now and expected to go up to 25,000. And those are estimates. And the worse your intel settings are, the more inaccurate those numbers could be. And here at Campaign Start, our intel situation is pretty bad. But it is for them too. And then their largest army, their Army of the Potomac, 19,000 men, slated to become 24,000 in their Army of the Potomac. Probably under the command of General Beauregard, and this force is probably under the command of General Joe Johnston. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around and kind of combine forces, reorient the divisional structures, that sort of thing, and kind of get these forces in a little bit better situation to get the clock rolling. And I'm going to do that, and it's going to take a little while. I'm going to do that off camera. So I will be back in a bit. Okay, so I've kind of done some organization and spreading around weapons and all that sort of thing, and I don't want to go over it in too much detail. But we had 5 forces, now we have 4, because I combined the 2 forces in Western Virginia. There was a militia force up here, basically just a small brigade, and I just transferred it to McClellan's Appalachian Army, is what I'm calling this. And so he'll be here in a couple of days, this force here. And there weren't really enough, I'm not really setting up my desired core, eventual core structure and all these things yet, but I kind of organized most of these into some initial form of divisional commands, artillery divisions separated out, that sort of thing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that probably in the next episode or 2 of how I eventually intend to structure the overall army across the entire map. But the first thing that's going to happen, as I said before, kind of need to do something with these troops now, is we need to get across the Potomac, engage and defeat the Confederate Army of the Potomac. I also renamed the armies too. Potomac Army, Shenandoah Army, Appalachian Army, and this one over here is the Missouri Army. Over here. And these are kind of shorthand. This would actually be called the Army of the Missouri, etc., etc. It's a little bit shorter, looks cleaner on the map. However, if I come right across and engage, pretty much a standard thing that the AI will do is they will put this force on the railroad and come over here and reinforce. And the two combined forces will be right around 30,000 men, about the same as ours. So that's, they wouldn't greatly outnumber us, but it'd be about the same. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to cross the Potomac up here with Patterson's Shenandoah Army. And I'm not really necessarily looking for a tactical map battle with the Shenandoah Army. But I may put them in defensive stance, come across, make contact, and tie this army up, and then come across to engage the Army of the Potomac with our big army under McDowell. If we do it that way, it's possible that it'll just go in reverse and the Army of the Potomac will come and reinforce. Matter of fact, he's already on rail going somewhere. I wonder what that's about. But if we're in a siege situation over here, then McDowell can then come over and join that. And we still have that even numbers battle, but, at least we will have tried. And it's possible that the Army of the Shenandoah... Actually, he's in defensive stance. That's what this little gold icon means. He's in defensive stance too. So I'm pretty sure he will not force a tactical battle over here. We can get a siege. Or maybe it's better just to come across and engage directly and just fight both armies. We have the size of army to do that. Of course, the troops are green and so forth, but that's true for the Confederates too. So, in any case, anyway, that's the plan for Virginia in the next episode. McClellan's Appalachian Army is at Orange readiness. Of course, his major kind of medium-term goal is to capture Western Virginia and make it kind of resecede back and join the Union as the state of West Virginia. That's one of our strategic objectives. In order to do that, the requirements are take Wheeling, Virginia, which we have, take Grafton, Virginia, which we have, and take Charleston, Virginia. So that's really what the main thing we need to do, and we have to defeat every Confederate army in Western Virginia. How exactly does that objective read? Capture Western Virginia. Capture Wheeling, Grafton, and Charleston. Defeat any Confederate armies to control Western Virginia. Okay. So even though this is still showing all as one state, the game is already differentiating between West Virginia and Virginia. You can even, as CSA, you can even see that in the recruits. There is no state of West Virginia, but there is a separate West Virginia recruiting pool, even if they stay Confederate. So basically what we need is control of all three of those towns and no Confederate army that is not retreating inside Western Virginia, which there's a kind of an invisible border running around through this area. We won't necessarily have to fight and defeat the Confederate Army of the Northwest if that army leaves that area and there's no Confederate Army in here at all. I've seen that happen before. But for now, while he improves readiness, we also want to kind of safeguard this communication links, this rail route and road route across northern Western Virginia. It's important for our infrastructure. And we want to make sure that we hang on to Grafton and they don't slip in back here and grab it while we're down getting Charleston. So for now, and this is almost identical to what I did in the previous Union campaign, kind of pre-scripted opening moves. For now, I am going to have him build a fort at Grafton. Something about like that should be fine. And that's what McClellan will be doing for now. And just building something will also get him earning XP toward opening this army perk slot. Later, after getting some more troops, getting readiness up, probably having been down this path before, just coming straight down this route to Charleston, there's not a lot of supply capacity through here. By the time he gets here, you know, it'll be all high attrition, no food, etc. So I will likely take him back out into Ohio and then approach Charleston via the much shorter route from this direction. That's kind of the short to near-term plan in Western Virginia for that force. Don't really have anything going on in Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio area yet because I'm not recruiting forces yet, as discussed earlier. I could recruit quite a few. We've got a nice manpower pool, but they're just going to be 12-year troops. So I'm going to wait a little bit on that. And then finally, over here, these Confederate forces down here around Carrollton and Fort Smith are bigger than Lyon's Army of the Missouri. And I don't have any big plans on advancing into Arkansas or Indian Territory is ours, but I don't have any big plans on advancing into Arkansas, and this region of Missouri really isn't that important. And the main thing with Missouri is ensure that we hang on to St. Louis, which is by far the most important town in this state. So given that, I'm going to he's kind of going to do the same thing that McClellan is doing in Western Virginia, in that I'm not going to keep him here. And then the other piece of not advancing is kind of like Western Virginia. The supply situation all through this area is pretty lackluster. So I am just going to pull Lyon back to St. Louis. And when he gets here, actually not quite that far, I'm going to pull him back to here. And when he gets here, he's going to do some fort building around St. Louis just to solidify and make sure we hang on to that. All this crap down here, Springfield, Carthage, Lebanon, yeah, whatever. Johnny Rib can have this part. I'm cool with that. Once that is done, and this will be later in the campaign, but this force will get some more brigades and so forth. It can start operating along the Mississippi, possibly in conjunction with supporting the army that by then should have been established in the Kentucky area. But we'll just see how it goes. That's the initial plan. And I think that will do. We've got kind of we've talked about the policies we started with, the plan for the next several episodes in 1861 for our policy research. We talked about the starting finances, and we've kind of gotten our armies in their initial shape. I didn't even look at. I did nothing at all with Navy just yet, but I'll get them all sorted off camera, and we'll talk about that either next episode or perhaps the episode after. So that will do for now, and in the next episode we're going to do some fighting in Northern Virginia. Probably here, near Manassas, or maybe over here in the Shenandoah. We'll see how that works out. Thank you very much for watching.